morning, everyone. Looks like it's about 10 a.m. Eastern. We may have some folks joining us in the first few minutes while we get rolling here, but we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for making the time to join us today for a presentation of research findings on targeting investment to maximize public safety along residential street segments. My name is Carrie Riddle, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis Center, or CINA for short. And also on the line today are CINA's Director, Dr. Jim Jones, and we will also have our DHS Program Manager, Dana Saft. For our audience on the line who may be less familiar with the center, I'll give a really quick summary. CINA is a DHS Center of Excellence based at George Mason University, and we're funded by DHS through a 10-year cooperative agreement under which we can conduct research on problems and challenges of interest to DHS as it relates to understanding organized crime and criminal activity and supporting efforts to disrupt it. CINA funds a number of projects that are executed by teams of experts at universities across the country, and our teams share research findings, knowledge products, tools, and trainings that can support DHS and law enforcement efforts to counter organized crime. The project and findings being discussed today are unique for CINA in that it has potential to support not only DHS and their state and local law enforcement partners, but also other public and private organizations that develop strategy and make decisions that can have an impact on public safety in cities and communities. So we may have a bit of a mixed audience on the line today from DHS, universities, and other organizations. We really appreciate everyone's time and interest and support of the center's research today. We'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards, and we're very interested in hearing from you all today. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to drop those into the chat anytime, and CINA's Director, Dr. Jones, will facilitate this afterwards. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Marie Tillyer from University of Texas, San Antonio, and her teammates, Dr. Rebecca Walter and Dr. Arthur Acklin at University of Washington. Dr. Tillyer is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and her team's findings presented today are the results of an ongoing CINA-funded project studying patterns of crime at 6 large U.S. cities over an 11-year period, and exploring which investments might be associated with improvements in public safety. So Marie and team, thanks very much for being here and for presenting today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carrie, very much. So let me go ahead and share my screen here with the audience. All right, good morning, all. As Carrie said, I'm Marie Tillyer, and I am a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Texas at San Antonio in the College for Health, Community, and Policy. And I'm joined today by my colleagues at the University of Washington, Drs. Rebecca Walter and Arthur Acklin, and they're in the Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments. And we've been working the past couple years, as Carrie said, on a project looking at crime patterns over time across 6 large US cities. What we're going to be presenting on today is going to focus on one segment of that project, and that is on how to target investment to maximize public safety along residential street segments. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm going to start off by presenting some of the findings that came out of an earlier part of the project that really led us to the work we're going to be presenting today. And so we know from looking at the literature that economic investment is one potential avenue for sustained place-based improvements to address the underlying criminogenic conditions of the built environment. And in fact, we do have a lot of policies at the federal, state, and local level to try to encourage development and investment activity in communities that have historically been under-resourced. But what we found when we looked at the literature is that a lot of this programming and policies are happening at larger spatial units. So oftentimes at census tracts that approximate neighborhoods. But when we look at what we know from the empirical research on spatiotemporal crime patterns over about 30, 35 years, is that crime tends to concentrate at really small units of analysis. So what we see is that in any given city, whether we're looking at addresses, street segments, blocks, businesses, you have a really small number of places that count for an overwhelming majority of crime. And so it doesn't quite make sense to think about crime necessarily at the neighborhood level. In addition to that, we see a lot of street to street variability. So even in communities that might historically been thought of as being, quote unquote, dangerous, there's plenty of streets that are safe. And so it isn't the case that we can think about entire neighborhoods as being safe or unsafe. We also see a great deal of stability year to year. So if an address or a street segment tends to be safe, that tends to carry on over time. And yet, even changes at relatively few places can have a big impact on a city's overall crime level, given how it concentrates, right? If you only have a small number of places that are causing problems, changes over time can have a big impact. So this led our team to ask the question of, can targeted place-based improvements reduce crime? And so that's really where we started at the beginning of this project. And so phase one of our study examined the relationship between two mechanisms for place-based improvements. The first was public regulation in the form of code enforcement, and I'll talk about that a little more here in a minute. And the second is private investment in the form of building permits, and the way that these two things might correlate with yearly changes in crime over time at street segments from 2008 to 2018. And we use data from 6 large cities: Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, San Antonio, and Seattle. So we use data that we aggregate to the nearest street segment. And so that means the length of a street until it intersects another street. And it includes properties and the events that occur on those properties on both sides of the street. We were also interested in the effects on nearby segments to detect spatial displacement and or diffusion of benefits. So in terms of spatial displacement, what we're talking about there is we wanted to make sure that even if we detected that, say, code enforcement is associated with a reduction in crime, we wanted to make sure those crimes weren't simply being pushed out into the surrounding area. So we measured the extent to which code enforcement and permanent activity might also impact nearby segments. In terms of diffusion of benefits, there is some evidence in the literature that when one place enjoys a reduction in crime, nearby places might benefit as well, even if they weren't directly treated. And so we were looking for these effects as well. So we use data from the police departments from each of these cities, and we did look at this by crime type. So violent and personal crimes, property crimes, disorder offenses, and other crimes. And then we also have code enforcement and building permit data from those cities' building departments. Code enforcement data, citations are issued when to property owners when city compliance officers receive a complaint. It's a way to try to get improvements or changes done at the property when there's violations occurring. On the other hand, building permit data capture a range of physical investments in the built environment, whether it be new construction, alterations, repairs, but they typically go beyond, routine maintenance to represent real improvements. And then we also controlled for zoning and land use. So when we think about why these things may have an impact, there's a number of mechanisms that could be at play, whether it be code enforcement or building permits that lead to investment. Each has the opportunity to create place-based improvements that might increase informal social control or reduce criminal opportunity that leads to crime reduction. By strengthening the housing and economic infrastructure, providing an incentive for property owners to reduce criminal opportunities because they've more invested in the property. But also improvements might change how potential offenders perceive the area and view it as less suitable for crime. Okay, so when we look at how crime concentrates within these cities, it's really consistent what others have found in other cities. So just to give you an idea here of this chart, what we have along the side here on the y-axis is the percent of street segments that account for 50%, 75%, and 90% of crimes that occurred during the study period. So let's take Seattle, for example. Over the 11-year period, half of all crimes in Seattle occurred at only 5% of street segments in the city. And while we do see some variations across cities in terms of concentration, overall, the picture really does show that a place-based strategy is promising, given that a small number of places seem to be driving the crime levels in these cities over a fairly significant period of time. So what we found when we looked at the extent to which code enforcement and private investment accounted for change, both were significantly associated with reductions in crime on street segments across all cities. As I mentioned, we did look at this by crime type. The effects were strongest for property crime, then violent crime, but they were all significant. There was no evidence of immediate spatial displacement. In other words, crime was not displaced to nearby segments, so we're not simply seeing dots being moved around the map. These were real reductions. And in fact, there was evidence of moderate diffusion of benefits. Nearby segments enjoyed the crime prevention benefits of code enforcement and private investment, even if the code enforcement and private investment didn't happen directly on that segment. Now, I should say it was moderate in the sense that the effect wasn't as strong, but there was still a significant effect. So this let us ask the question of what factors might amplify or depress the crime reductive benefits of investment specifically in residential areas. So given what we know now that it may be beneficial to target investment, what would be the most beneficial way of doing that? So there is some research to suggest that investment might be particularly impactful in the most under-resourced communities that have historically experienced disinvestment. So this research has looked at things like public improvement projects, mortgage lending, for example. But again, a lot of this work has been targeted at larger spatial units. So they don't actually measure where within the community the investment went or whether that correlated with reductions in crime. And so what we see is the evidence is a bit mixed, but again, they're not directly measuring where the investment in crime are within communities. And so our project uses building permit data as a direct indicator of physical investment. And again, that allows us to capture a range of physical investments in the built environment. And we're able to measure at the micro level using address level data aggregated to the street segment so we can measure where investment and crime occur within communities. And so for phase two, one of our research questions is, does the negative relationship between building permits and crime on street segments vary by neighborhood characteristics? And so we're interested in a range of neighborhood characteristics. The first one, concentrated disadvantage, is a factor that makes up the poverty rate, the unemployment rate, the extent to which residents are receiving SNAP benefits, education levels. The second one, residential stability, measures the proportion of residents who have remained in their homes since 2004. So trying to capture the extent to which there is residential stability or more instability in turnover in the community. We also measure median housing values, population density, the racial and ethnic composition of the resident population, and the immigrant population. So similar to phase one, we're using crime incident and building permit data measured at the street segment level. And then all of those neighborhood level characteristics I just described, we measure at the census tract level using 2010 ASC 5-year estimates. In order to be in the sample, all segments with only residential properties based on Zillow's transaction and assessment database were used, and segments that had no changes in crime and building permits over the course of the study were dropped since we're interested in capturing change over time. So how did we go about answering this question? Well, we began by stratifying the residential segments in each city into terciles for each track level moderator. So for example, let's take Chicago. We have all the residential street segments in Chicago, And we divided them up based on low levels of concentrated disadvantage, medium levels of concentrated disadvantage, and high levels of concentrated disadvantage, so that we could see if the effects of building permit on crime varied depending on the level of concentrated disadvantage in the community. And we did that for each of those census tract variables. We then estimated the relationship between building permits on the segment and crime in the following year using spatial Durbin models. And these include spatial lags for crime and building permits, again, to capture that idea of what's going on the neighboring segments, so we could capture whether or not there's displacement or diffusion of benefits. And then the models also include street segment and census tract by year fixed effects to try to control for time invariant omitted variables at the street segment level and time varying characteristics of the surrounding neighborhood. And then finally, all of the differences I'm going to talk about today, we did test for differences in coefficients across the terciles. And so when I say that there's a difference or something stronger, that means it is significantly different. So for our first census tract level moderator, concentrated disadvantage, what we have here at the top is each of our study cities listed. And then along the y-axis, you'll see that they're negative values because for all cities, the relationship between building permits and crime is negative. As building permits increase over time, crime tends to go down. And then down here at the bottom, you see green for low, yellow for medium, and red for high to represent those terciles, low, medium, and high levels of concentrated disadvantage. So for all cities, street segments that are in census tracts with high levels of disadvantage enjoy a greater crime prevention benefit from investment. So you can see, for example, in New York City, the effect size is much larger when levels of concentrated disadvantage are high. So in other words, when we invest in communities where there's high levels of concentrated disadvantage, we see a greater crime prevention benefit. Next, we look at levels of residential stability. Here we have the low value in red because that represents lots of turnover. And what we see is in Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, and Seattle, that is where building permits have the biggest impact on crime. Those communities where we have low levels of residential stability. Meanwhile, in San Antonio, where I am, you see the reverse effect. Next, we look at it by median housing value. And with the exception of New York City, street segments that are in communities with low housing values benefit the most from investment. So again, New York City shows sort of the opposite effect, but the other cities, you see the largest impact in segments that are in communities with low median housing values. In terms of the impact of population density on the relationship, for Chicago, LA, Philadelphia, and Seattle, those segments that are in very dense census tracts have the biggest impact. For San Antonio, New York, there's no significant difference between medium levels of population density and high levels of population density. But again, in general, when segments are in census tracts with more dense populations, they benefit more from investment. Next, when we look at it by resident demographics, we see sort of mixed findings across cities. So for LA, in Philadelphia, and San Antonio, census tracts with larger populations of non-white residents enjoy a greater public safety benefit from investment, but we see the opposite effect in Chicago, New York, and Seattle. And finally, when we look at it by immigrant population, for Chicago, LA, New York, San Antonio, and Seattle, street segments that are in communities with larger immigrant populations enjoy a greater public safety benefit from investment. The reverse is true when we look at Philadelphia. So just to summarize, with a few exceptions, the effect of building permits on crime was strongest among segments in neighborhoods with high levels of concentrated disadvantage, low residential stability, low housing values, high population density, and larger immigrant populations, whereas the moderating effect of the resident racial and ethnic composition was less consistent across cities. That seemed to be a more city-specific effect. And so this leads us to, in terms of implications, it really suggests that we should encourage policies that incentivize investment in high crime investment. And so there's some ways to go about doing that, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if folks are interested. But one is to capitalize on existing programs and resources by leveraging partnerships and allocating resources to specific places. So we know across these cities, a lot of programs already exist, but a lot of times they exist at larger spatial units. And so the more we can think about how to target investment at high crime locations, and especially high crime locations that are embedded within the communities that have the characteristics we just talked about, that's where we'll see the greatest public safety benefit. We should also target such action in a way to avoid unintended negative consequences. Being careful, for example, that we don't just do things that will displace residents from their own communities. And so to be thoughtful about that type of intervention as well. So, as the federal government and elected officials consider major investments in infrastructure and community redevelopment, we know a lot of folks are interested in how to enhance community outcomes using, not just our law enforcement partners, but other partners as well. And so, our interdisciplinary research team in criminology, real estate, and urban planning are hoping to provide guidance to DHS that they can take the lead on with their public and private partners on how to strategically invest in communities in a way that will not just create public safety, but also spur additional investment that helps sustain growth in these communities. So, in terms of what's next for our project or for our group, we have a proposal in right now to look at the effects of opportunity zones on crime. So, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 created a new place based tax incentive program that encourages private investment in distressed communities. And this represents one of the most significant economic development tools in recent years. But there's been really little research done on the public safety benefits of opportunity zones. And all opportunity zone research to date that we could find, whether it's on public safety or otherwise, has been conducted using census tract level data. And so, as we've talked about here today, we know that crime tends to concentrate at smaller units of analysis. And so we're proposing to evaluate the impact of opportunity zones using a more microscale approach where we can measure where within opportunity zone census tracts the investment and crime occur. And that would go beyond the data we used in the current study. We're interested in extending to more cities, but also going beyond measuring building permits to actually measure the dollar cost value of investment attached to those permits, so we can have more precise estimates of the impacts. And so, more broadly speaking, we're hoping to help develop a full range of outcomes understanding associated with significant federal legislation in a way that will help build safe and economically sustainable communities. And with that, we are happy to answer questions. If you're interested in our work, we have a few publications that recently came out. The first one listed there is on the phase 1 findings that I talked about. The second one is on findings I didn't get to today that cover more of the stability and change over time across the 6 cities in crime.